Many stories of violent crime leave us shaking our heads, wondering how an individual can abandon the moral code society takes for granted. There are cases, though, that push these boundaries further, unsettling even seasoned true crime devotees by revealing a web of deceit, cruelty, and a deeply fractured psyche. The saga of Vladimir Vinničevsky belongs firmly in that unnerving category. For years, he prowled the outskirts of a mid-sized city in Eastern Europe, his actions so discreet that local police attributed early incidents to random outbursts or separate offenders. By the time investigators finally perceived a chilling pattern, a string of victims had already suffered his manipulations and brutality. In popular media, certain criminals develop reputations overshadowing the real human cost of their wrongdoing. The shock value, the sensational headlines, and the lurid details attract attention, but they often obscure the genuine emotional damage left behind. In the case of Vladimir Vinničevsky, one is reminded of how real people, neighbors, friends, relatives, were caught in a vortex of unpredictability and terror. Behind the sensational aspects of the case lies a roster of individuals who vanished, were harmed, nothing, or witnessed horrors that would shape their entire lives thereafter. Throughout this narrative, we will delve methodically into multiple dimensions of Vinničevsky's story. It begins with an examination of his humble upbringing and the subtle but telling red flags that foreshadowed the violence he would one day unleash. Next, we will reconstruct his criminal journey in meticulous detail, marking every incident known to investigators, every shift in modus operandi, and every tactic he refined to evade detection. After that, nothing. We will turn to the painstaking process of capturing him, a process that tested the resolve of local law enforcement and eventually involved a specialized task force. These chapters hold lessons about institutional blind spots, as well as the virtues of inter-departmental collaboration and data sharing. Then, we will embark on a deep psychological exploration, considering the interplay of personal pathology, environmental factors, and the socio-cultural context that might have contributed to the making of a killer. Concepts such as the narcissism spectrum, psychopathy, and the various influences of disrupted family ties will be woven throughout. We will culminate in a conclusion that aims to situate Vinničevsky's crimes in broader discussions of public safety and mental health infrastructures. More importantly, it will advocate for ethical, true crime consumption, maintaining empathy for the victims and their families while seeking to glean lessons that could prevent future tragedies. Finally, we will encourage readers, and viewers, if this were adapted for another medium, to recognize that vigilance and informed communities can sometimes intercede before the escalation of dangerous behavior. While the following pages are unsettling, the goal is not to gratuitously dwell on gore or sensationalism. Rather, it is an effort to chronicle how one individual, through a convergence of psychological anomalies, personal choices, and systemic oversights, managed to commit heinous acts that perplexed a region for years. In a cautious spirit, let us now step into the shadows where Vladimir Vinničevsky thrived and see how his trajectory evolved from a troubled youth to a name steeped in notoriety. Part 2. The criminal journey. Early childhood and family background. It is often said that the seeds of later deviance can be traced to childhood, and while this isn't always the case, a look at Vladimir Vinničevsky's family life offers disconcerting hints of trouble. Born in the late 1970s to a working-class couple in a provincial city near the border of two Eastern European nations, he was the youngest of 3 children. Family acquaintances recollect that the Vinničevsky household was neither prosperous nor disastrously poor, but it was fraught with tension. His father, a mid-level factory employee, frequently clashed with management and hopped from one short-term contract to another. As the family's primary breadwinner, he was perpetually exhausted, moody and prone to sporadic bursts of anger. His mother, a homemaker with intermittent cleaning jobs, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy but struggled with chronic illness. From an early age, Vladimir stood out for his withdrawn nature. Teachers noticed that he resisted group activities, never volunteering for roles in plays or sports. He didn't seem to have close friends, merely acquaintances with whom he shared a desk or walked home. While some children had imaginary friends or daydreamed about adventures, Vladimir's imagination drifted toward darker, solitary preoccupations. According to one anecdote passed along by a neighbor, as early as age 8 he had a peculiar fascination with hunting knives. Though the neighbor brushed it off at the time, in retrospect, that early fixation underscores a propensity toward items associated with dominance and harm. Unlike many children who demonstrate antisocial tendencies, Vladimir did not overtly bully classmates. If anything, he maintained a subdued presence, preferring to stay under the radar. On the home front, tensions brewed. Arguments about finances and his father's sporadic employment left the household in near constant upheaval. Some nights, Vladimir witnessed heated shouting matches that ended abruptly in a chilling quiet. These formative experiences instilled in him a sense of instability, a latent anger that found no healthy outlet. By the time he approached adolescence, subtle warning signs, lack of empathy, mood fluctuations, morbid curiosities were beginning to solidify. Adolescence and the mask of normalcy with puberty. The complexities of Vladimir's personality intensified. Physically unremarkable, he didn't stand out as either a sports talent or an academic achiever, so teachers rarely gave him extra attention. Those who did notice him occasionally commented on his persistent sense of detachment. It wasn't just teenage aloofness. There was an underlying element of calculation. Nothing. Classmates described him as cunning when it served his interest. He might lie about stolen items to direct suspicion elsewhere. Yet he presented a disarming, docile demeanor when questioned. A thing. This duality foreshadowed the manipulative streak that would later prove lethal. Despite occasional glimpses of troubling behavior, such as rumors of harming neighborhood pets or instigating minor vandalism, Vladimir largely navigated his teenage years without drawing significant penalties. In fact, some neighbors found him polite, and he occasionally assisted older residents with errands. Whether he did so for personal gain or to maintain a facade remains a matter of debate. By age 16, he was adept at wearing a mask of normalcy, fooling people into viewing him as just another adolescent traversing the confusion of teenage life. Within the Vinničevsky household, friction grew more acute. His father's sporadic violent outbursts left the entire family on edge, often culminating in the father retreating to bars for nights on end. These episodes further eroded the domestic atmosphere, and Vladimir seemed to internalize the chaos, forging internal narratives about power, control, and how to circumvent direct confrontation. If cornered, he would lie shamelessly, employing a calm, almost chillingly methodical approach. Looking back, one might argue that if mental health evaluations had been standard in their region, specialists might have flagged Vladimir's behaviors. But in that place and time, such interventions were uncommon, and as long as no major crimes were committed, any mild social deviance simply went unnoticed. Vladimir completed basic schooling, finishing with unspectacular grades, an aura of unexceptional anonymity. Beneath this mundane exterior, however, a dark swirl of impulses was steadily coalescing. The pivot to adulthood and the first experiments of the years after formal education mark a precarious juncture for many emerging adults. Nothing, especially those who come from unstable family backgrounds. For Vladimir, they were a period of trial, error, and the tentative forging of a new identity. He attempted a technical apprenticeship in metalworking then left it abruptly with no explanation. He drifted through a series of menial jobs. Seasonal work at a construction site, casual shifts at a local warehouse, none of which he held for long. References from supervisors uniformly described him as competent but unnerving, citing instances of him glaring silently at coworkers or showing zero emotion when confronted over minor missteps. Though he avoided forming deep friendships, Vladimir occasionally mingled with local youths, especially in bars on the city's outskirts. It was in these rougher circles that he began what some investigators would later describe as his first experiments with manipulation and low-level violence. He lured unsuspecting individuals into risky scenarios, exaggerated gambling bets, alcohol-fueled challenges, and observed how they reacted. While the city's bar scene had its share of quarrels, none of these early incidents explicitly tied back to him, for he was careful to orchestrate them from the shadows. A confrontation might unfold between two drunken patrons, seemingly spontaneous, nothing, but in truth triggered by Vladimir's whispered provocations. This indirect cruelty offered him a sense of control, a foretaste of what could be achieved with the right leverage. Around this time, he also began frequenting local pawn shops, acquiring an array of items from hunting knives to camouflage gear. No single purchase appeared sinister on its own, but collectively, they hinted at an unhealthy fascination with subterfuge and the mechanics of harm. Despite these ominous signs, no specific incident yet warranted police investigation, allowing him ample time to refine his manipulative repertoire. Escalations, rumored assaults, and the first real victims by his mid-20s. Vladimir's drifting existence was overshadowed by rumors of far more direct aggression. Whispers abounded of young people gone missing, after nights spent in the city's darker corners. Though proof was scarce, some local folk attributed disappearances to runaways or drug-related entanglements. Yet certain patterns stood out in nearly every case. The missing individual had been spotted in the company of an aloof, pale man who wore a distinctive dark jacket. Descriptions of him varied. Some said he was tall, others that he had an unusual accent, but the overall theme pointed to someone who matched Vladimir's silhouette. One especially alarming rumor involved a local woman who had been found unconscious near an abandoned lot, bearing bruises and knife grazes. She couldn't recall the attacker's face, nothing, but remembered an unsettling voice repeatedly asking if she trusted him. The authorities, responding to the public outcry, sought leads, but testimonies were riddled with inconsistencies. Vladimir remained off the radar, having no direct link to the victim beyond second-hand sightings. The city, grappling with its usual spate of petty crimes, dedicated minimal resources to a case that seemed unsolvable. Still, as more rumors piled up, an eerie consensus started to form in certain neighborhoods. There was a dangerous presence lurking, someone cunning enough to evade detection. While Vladimir hadn't yet adopted a repeated signature, like the patterns famously exploited by criminal profilers, he was nonetheless refining his methods. According to retrospective data gleaned from phone records, credit receipts, and anecdotal testimonies, he began systematically targeting vulnerable individuals who were isolated, intoxicated, or otherwise easier to control. These alleged early victims often came from marginalized backgrounds, limiting their families' capacity to generate media attention or official pressure. Building a sinister modus operandi over time, Vladimir did settle on a rough modus operandi, albeit one that lacked the ritualistic flair often associated with serial predators. His approach was grounded in psychological manipulation rather than elaborate staging. Typically, he'd frequent the city's nightlife areas, scanning for loners or people in distress. Someone leaving a bar alone, an argument, scarred couple who separated in anger. A casual conversation or a small gesture of help offering to fix a stranger's faulty car battery, for instance, would serve as his in. He had a knack for gaining trust quickly, an unnerving skill for someone who displayed so little empathy. Once the target was sufficiently comfortable or incapacitated, and through alcohol, sometimes laced with sedatives, Vladimir escorted them to secluded spots. These could be disused industrial zones on the city's perimeter, abandoned construction sites, or even deserted rural paths. The victim, if coherent enough, might sense the trap too late, either paralyzed by fear or physically incapacitated. From this point on, the details turned brutal, with Vladimir exerting absolute dominance. In certain instances, he simply robbed them and left them battered but alive. In other cases, he appeared to relish going further, culminating in murder. For a long stretch, no consistent evidence linked these incidents. Some victims simply vanished, while others turned up with partial recollections. In a contradictory twist, those who encountered him in non-threatening settings often recalled a subdued demeanor. An older woman who employed him for odd jobs around the house described him as quiet, polite, and always punctual. That duality, helpful in one moment, predatory in another, mirrored the two faces of Vladimir Vinničevsky. Only when a victim's disappearance overlapped with statements from multiple witnesses did faint outlines of suspicion begin creeping in his direction. Near captures and the slipstream of luck. Given the mounting rumors and unexplained vanishings, one might suspect that Vladimir's capture was inevitable. In reality, he nearly ended up in custody several times. One noteworthy incident involved a bystander who witnessed a physical altercation behind a nightclub. The witness claimed to see Vladimir forcibly pushing a young man toward a parked car. Upon being confronted, Vladimir calmly produced a fabricated story about helping an intoxicated friend get home, even showing a set of keys that supposedly belonged to the friend. The bystander, unconvinced, took down the car's license plate and later reported the event to police. When officers investigated, the plate turned out to be stolen, and Vladimir was nowhere to be found. Similar close calls repeated. In one instance, Vladimir was actually detained for questioning when a severely injured victim identified a man with cold, gray eyes as the assailant. But other details in her testimony didn't match Vladimir's appearance. She mentioned tattoos on the suspect's arm, whereas Vladimir had none, leading the police to release him. Such discrepancies might have been the result of trauma-induced confusion, or perhaps Vladimir deliberately wore fake tattoos or used theatrical means to obscure his identity. Either way, the authorities lacked enough concrete evidence to press charges. These close calls sharpened Vladimir's instincts. He adjusted small aspects of his behavior, varying his clothing, changing vehicles frequently, moving among different neighborhoods, and even adopting subtle dialect shifts to confuse potential witnesses. In effect, each near capture taught him how to become more elusive. Ironically, the more the city's rumors escalated, the more carefully he chose his victims, ensuring minimal direct links back to him. For local law enforcement, the puzzle was fast becoming a labyrinth of half-clues and circumstantial dead ends. A spree ignited, nothing. Escalations into bolder territory, tensions in the city reached new highs when a string of particularly gruesome discoveries emerged over a span of several months. Nothing. These were no longer silent disappearances or questionable assaults, but overt acts of violence that left communities reeling. Official statements described victims with deep lacerations, defensive wounds, and evidence of sadistic overkill. Some observers drew parallels to known serial murderers in other regions, but the police urged caution, citing that they still had no definitive suspect. Nonetheless, behind closed doors, the city's investigative division quietly acknowledged a horrifying possibility. They were dealing with a violent serial offender who had grown both confident and methodical. In these later crimes, the culprit left behind minimal forensic traces, suggesting premeditation. Local experts speculated that, if it was indeed the same individual, he had gained enough experience and audacity to stage scenes in a way that confounded standard procedure. For Vladimir Vinničevsky, these months seemed to mark a shift from opportunistic violence to a self-styled spree, as if he relished taunting authorities by increasing the frequency and brutality of his acts. The manner in which victims were approached, incapacitated, and ultimately disposed of reflected a lethal skill set he had perfected over a decade of smaller-scale offenses. Nothing. Victims were carefully selected to create the least public commotion, and he orchestrated interactions under the veil of normalcy, forging half-baked acquaintances or feigning altruism. Ironically, his cunning also sowed chaos among law enforcement ranks. While some detectives insisted the pattern was undeniable, others suspected multiple offenders or a copycat phenomenon. Prelude to the final rampage. As the city roiled with anxiety, Vladimir continued maneuvering through its social seams with unsettling ease. Bar patrons whispered rumors of a phantom predator who walked among them. Neighborhood watches sprang up spontaneously, with volunteer groups patrolling certain streets after dark. Authorities issued safety bulletins advising caution, but official statements remained vague, largely out of fear that confirming a serial killer in their midst would spawn mass hysteria. By the turn of the next year, Vladimir's caution seemed to fracture. Perhaps emboldened by his repeated success at evading capture, he perpetrated a sequence of assaults within a compressed timeframe. Nothing. Over a mere 6-week period, multiple violent incidents rocked different corners of the city, from a brutal mugging near the railway station to the discovery of a body in a deserted warehouse. Each case brought renewed demands for action. In the court of public opinion, the local police department was on trial for its perceived inaction or incompetence. Unknown to the public, behind police station walls, a number of detectives had pieced together enough fragments to suspect that the elusive criminal was one man. Although they lacked conclusive forensic proof, the recurring threads. A calm, unremarkable man with a quiet demeanor, sightings of a figure wearing a dark jacket, an interest in subdued but vicious methods. Pointed, albeit indirectly, nothing, toward Vladimir Vinničevsky. All that remained was bridging the gap between suspicion and tangible evidence. In the next part of our narrative, we will examine the intricacies of this cat and mouse chase. How law enforcement finally caught wind of Vladimir's identity and the steps they took, both successful and flawed, to bring him to justice. Part 3, the capturing process, early investigative missteps, when confronted with a case as baffling as that of Vladimir Vinničevsky. Local law enforcement inevitably wrestles with a barrage of investigative challenges. In the initial phases, the department had only scattered indicators. Missing persons reports, unverified sightings, and rumor-laden tip-offs. Lacking a single unifying thread, senior detectives either shelved these incidents as unrelated or found them too circumstantial to allocate substantial resources. Some of the earliest investigative missteps revolved around departmental silos. Information from one district rarely made it to another, especially if the offense was classified under different categories. For instance, minor assaults with no fatalities weren't always cross-referenced with missing persons data. Only when particularly gruesome homicides surfaced did a handful of more experienced officers notice that there might be a common thread. Further complicating the situation, many of Vladimir's alleged victims had precarious lifestyles. Some were transients or undocumented workers, while others had personal histories of substance abuse. These realities made it harder for relatives or acquaintances to raise the alarm promptly. In a region where resources were thin, the police often prioritized cases with clearer suspects or political pressures. As a result, Vladimir lurked in the background, honing his destructive craft with minimal interference. A turning point came when a mid-level detective named Stanislav Kachenko spotted a pattern in the incident logs. Kachenko noticed that over a span of months, multiple victims, some alive, nothing, others deceased, had described or been linked to an individual who offered unsolicited help or exhibited an eerily calm demeanor during conflict situations. Even then, lacking a name or photographic evidence, Tikachenko found himself stymied by superiors unconvinced that the incidents were connected. A formal attempt at building a multi-district intelligence file faltered amid bureaucratic inertia. The formation of a task force, growing public outrage at the wave of violent crimes, and the sensational media coverage that followed, eventually forced the hand of higher authorities. City officials convened a meeting with law enforcement heads, pressing for immediate, tangible results. As a compromise, they approved forming a dedicated task force to tackle the rash of unsolved assaults and homicides. Staffed with detectives from multiple precincts, forensics specialists, and a liaison to the local prosecutor's office, this unit was granted a larger, and though still modest, budget and broader investigative powers. The task force assembled a central database, painstakingly combing through old case files, autopsy reports, sex-CV footage, and victim statements. They arranged interviews with witnesses who had previously been dismissed or overlooked. Patterns began emerging, repeated references to a quiet man who might approach individuals at night under benign pretenses, descriptions of a small white scar near his left eyebrow, footprints of a certain shoe size at multiple crime scenes. Although each clue by itself was flimsy, collectively they suggested a single repeat offender. With this new momentum, Detective Kachenko's earlier theories gained traction. He and a small group of colleagues focused on the concept of one predator. Every scrap of testimony about suspicious men in the area was cross-referenced. Though Vladimir's name occasionally popped up, it wasn't yet pegged as top priority, overshadowed by a handful of known petty criminals with violent pasts. Ironically, Vladimir's unremarkable record, no prior convictions or well-documented incidents, allowed him to sidestep direct suspicion. The break in the cases. A survivor's account, cases of violent crime occasionally pivot dramatically when a would-be victim survives with enough composure to describe vital details. In Vladimir's trajectory, that pivot occurred when a 28-year-old woman named Marina, a surname withheld in many records for privacy, managed to escape his clutches. Marina had been leaving a local pub late one evening when a friendly, seeming man offered to walk her home. It was close to midnight, the streets dimly lit. Initially wary, she was swayed by his mild demeanor and calm, polite speech. According to Marina's recollection, the man suggested a shortcut through an underpass. Partway through, he grabbed her arm, nothing, brandishing a small blade and ordering her to keep silent. In a stroke of fortune, another pedestrian happened to pass by the underpass entrance, momentarily distracting the assailant. Seizing the opportunity, Marina managed to twist free and ran. Screaming for help, the attacker fled in the opposite direction. Though traumatized, Marina retained enough presence of mind to note specific details: the aggressor's approximate height, a faint scar above his left eyebrow, a dark jacket, and a muted accent that wasn't local to the region. When she reported the incident, Marina's consistent testimony and visible injuries galvanized the task force. The scar, in particular, resonated with earlier references in the compiled database. Detective Tkachenko, upon hearing her account, realized they finally had a near match to a ghostly suspect. With Marina's assistance, the police generated a composite sketch that quickly circulated among precincts and citizen watch groups. While the rendering wasn't an exact match to Vladimir, it was close enough to prompt new leads, narrowing in on a suspect list, armed with the composite sketch and a more refined suspect profile. Male mid to late 30s, potentially from outside the immediate city, with a notable eyebrow scar. The task force scoured local records. They cross-checked hospital admissions for any facial injury that might lead to a scar, plus employment records of individuals who had moved into the area within the past decade. Vladimir's name surfaced, albeit modestly. He had once been treated at a walk in clinic for a minor head wound, though the details were incomplete. The real clincher, however, came from a landlord who recognized the composite and recalled renting a small efficiency room to a reclusive tenant. That tenant, apparently, paid in cash, avoided neighbors, and left abruptly after only 3 months. The landlord had glimpsed a faint brow scar, but recalled the tenant frequently wearing a cap pulled low. After scoring city registries, nothing. It turned out the man had used the name Vladimir Vinničevsky, which seemed fake upon closer inspection. Still, data gleaned from that rental form included partial matching descriptors: height, approximate build, and an uncertain age bracket. Detectives began suspecting that Vladimir Vinničevsky might be an alias for the elusive man they now believed was behind multiple assaults and homicides. The subsequent cross, referencing of phone records from that lodging period, led to a phone number that, while no longer active, had occasionally been in contact with a different number traced to a small mechanicus shop where an individual named Vladimir Vinničevsky had briefly worked. The thread, albeit tenuous, suggested a link between Vinogradov and Vinničevsky. That was enough for the task force to place Vladimir on its short list of persons of interest. The surveillance operation, without concrete evidence, charging Vladimir directly was impossible. Thus, the task force orchestrated a multi-pronged surveillance plan. Plainclothes officers trailed him discreetly, mapping his routine, noting his interactions, and observing patterns that might match the suspected nocturnal stalking. At the same time, teams scoured older case files from years prior, attempting to determine if Vladimir's presence in certain neighborhoods coincided with unsolved crimes. This phase was maddeningly slow. Vladimir lived in a modest apartment on the city's fringe, maintained sporadic employment in manual labor, and rarely socialized. He frequented grocery stores, occasionally spent evenings in small, unremarkable bars, and visited a local internet cafe where he mostly browsed unknown websites. The surveillance teams grew frustrated by his seemingly benign routines. No suspicious late-night activities materialized during their stakeouts. Some detectives suspected that he had noticed the increased police presence. Indeed, investigators began to see subtle shifts. Vladimir abruptly changed the hours he left home, sometimes going out just before dawn, or he'd stay indoors for days, as though waiting for watchers to lose patience. The cat and mouse tension escalated. Each time the police felt they might catch him in the act, he seemed to slip away. It further reinforced the notion that they were dealing with someone hyper, vigilant, and deeply cunning. Qualities that had allowed him to operate undetected for so long. Unearthing forensic links, the break in the standoff arrived via a previously overlooked piece of forensic evidence. In one of the unsolved homicide cases, a single partial fingerprint had been recovered from a piece of broken glass near the scene. At the time, it hadn't matched any prints in the police database. But with Vladimir now on their radar, detectives discovered he had once been printed for a minor job application at a security firm, a job he never actually completed. Nothing. Comparing that archival fingerprint to the partial from the crime scene generated a strong partial match. Not conclusive enough for an airtight court case, but extremely suggestive. This partial match prompted a flurry of behind-the-scenes moves. The task force, sensing that they were closing in, approached the prosecutor's office for a more expansive warrant to search Vladimir's apartment. Given the gravity of the allegations, the request was granted. In a sweeping raid conducted early one morning, a group of officers and forensics experts entered Vladimir's place, seizing electronics, personal documents, clothing, and any items that might link him to the array of crimes. Though the immediate findings at his apartment were less dramatic than in certain lurid true crime tales. There was no hidden torture chamber or gruesome trophies lying in plain sight. The investigators did find suspicious details. A closet contained multiple sets of clothing in various sizes, including items possibly belonging to different individuals, along with a stash of mismatched ID cards and driver's licenses. More tellingly, they discovered knives, gloves, and other paraphernalia that could be used in abductions or assaults, though none of that alone was indisputable proof of homicide. Interrogation. The calm unraveling Vladimir was taken into custody for questioning. What followed was a marathon interrogation spanning multiple days, with investigators rotating to maintain pressure. Interestingly, Vladimir did not display the panic or aggression one might expect from a cornered serial offender. Instead, he exhibited eerie composure, asserting that he was the victim of a vast misunderstanding. He calmly explained away the knives as tools for odd jobs, the mismatched clothing as items left by previous roommates, and the fake IDs as objects he claimed to have found randomly. Detectives found themselves alternating between frustration and suspicion. Vladimir's rationales were far-fetched, yet he delivered them with unwavering confidence. The partial fingerprint match was presented, and while he conceded that he might have touched something while working odd jobs near that area, he vehemently denied involvement in any violence. Marina's testimony was invoked too, but Vladimir's lawyer quickly pointed out that her description could fit many men in the city. The interrogation seemed to teeter on a knife's edge. On one side lay the possibility of a confession, on the other the risk of him walking out due to insufficient evidence. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, forensic analysts scoured the confiscated items and digital data from Vladimir's devices. Chat logs, internet search histories, and location traces gleaned from phone towers offered further circumstantial evidence. It became clear he had scoured news articles about local assaults, particularly paying attention to official statements. It was as though he studied the coverage to refine his methods. Combined with the suspicious data on the phone, some investigators felt they were building a net tight enough to hold him. Final charges and the community's reaction. The tipping point arrived when additional data analysis from older crime scenes indicated a match for Vladimir's genetic profile. Through hair samples, among other evidence, though the lab results were partial, they reinforced the probability of his culpability in at least 2 murders. With that, the prosecutor's office decided the threshold for formal charges had been met. Vladimir was officially charged with multiple counts of murder, assault, and related offenses. While the exact victim count remained uncertain, prosecutors took a strategic approach, focusing on a select group of cases with the strongest forensic ties. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Local media outlets plastered Vladimir's mugshot everywhere, often labeling him ruthless predator or the city's phantom. Those who knew him casually reacted with disbelief, recalling a quiet if somewhat odd neighbor or co-worker. The families of victims, long languishing in uncertainty, felt a mixture of relief and renewed grief, the unspeakable reality of their loved ones' final moments coming starkly into view. Paradoxically, a section of the community adopted a macabre fascination with Vladimir's case, leading to a swirl of sensational rumors. Some claimed he kept souvenirs, Others insisted he was part of a larger cult. The truth was less dramatic, but the speculation underscored how profoundly his predatory acts had penetrated collective fears. In official statements, nothing. Law enforcement sought to reassure the public that the worst was over, even as they acknowledged ongoing investigations to see if additional victims could be linked to him. The wheels of justice now turned toward a trial. The next phase would feature testimonies from survivors, forensic experts, psychiatrists, and an avalanche of evidence gleaned from Vladimir's digital footprint. It was a complex tapestry, but the overall narrative was clear. The city's most elusive criminal was finally in custody. Yet as the court dates drew near, a deeper question lingered. Why had Vladimir Vinničevsky developed such a warped moral compass? And what could be learned from the path that led him to commit unspeakable acts? This leads us to a crucial dimension of the story, the psychological roots that shaped his criminal evolution. In the subsequent section, we will delve into the intricate mosaic of Vladimir's psyche, exploring factors like early childhood trauma, possible personality disorders, nothing, and the broader cultural environment that might have molded him into a figure of near mythical menace. Part 4 Psychological Analysis. Weaving the psychological tapestry to grasp the essence of Vladimir Vinničevsky's capacity for calculated violence, one must embark on an in-depth psychological study, sifting through personal history, social contexts, and potential clinical disorders, though definitive psychiatric evaluations remain partially confidential. Leaked segments of court-ordered assessments, along with interviews from those who interacted with him, offer invaluable insights. We discover a mind shaped by a litany of environmental stressors, marked by manipulative tendencies, and further sharpened by the vacuum of empathetic support systems. Psychological theories commonly stress the importance of early intervention in preventing the trajectory toward extreme deviance. In Vladimir's case, repeated indicators, his fascination with weapons, the cunning approach to social interactions, the apparent absence of deep emotional bonds, were never addressed. Had there been robust mental health screening in local schools or a system that flagged children who exhibited peculiar behaviors and social withdrawal, he might have received therapeutic input. Alas, the era and region in which he grew up offered negligible infrastructure for such interventions. Experts analyzing his adult patterns highlight a phenomenon described as a mask of normalcy, a behavioral strategy akin to what certain psychiatrists term a pseudo-adaptive persona. In everyday life, Vladimir presented himself as subdued, helpful enough to avoid suspicion, but distant enough to discourage deeper scrutiny. He seemed to have minimal emotional investment in forging genuine relationships, focusing instead on ephemeral interactions that enabled him to vanish at will. Potential antisocial and narcissistic traits. The mosaic of Vladimir's psychological profile suggests prominent antisocial traits, including deceitfulness, disregard for social norms, impulsivities that manifested selectively, and a lack of remorse. These attributes align with criteria outlined by mental health professionals for antisocial personality disorder (ASP). However, diagnosing him with AST alone might oversimplify the layered complexity of his psyche. Some mental health specialists argue that he also exhibited flashes of narcissism, evident in his brazen confidence, sense of superiority over peers, and manipulative tactics geared toward personal gratification. In multiple interrogations and psychological evaluations, Vladimir reportedly displayed a veneer of calm that was unnerving to seasoned investigators. Rarely did he show emotional distress about the alleged crimes. Instead, he rationalized his actions or dismissed them with deflections like, "People misunderstand me." Such responses mirror psychopathic or narcissistic dimensions, where empathy is absent or severely diminished. and the individual prioritizes self-preservation above all else. One complicating factor is that criminals with strong narcissistic components can be extremely adept at mimicking empathy when it serves their ends. That might explain how Vladimir lured victims under the guise of assistance. For instance, the disarming composure he showed in offering to help Marina before attempting to attack her underscores a chilling aptitude for situational manipulation. The prospect of humiliating and harming a trusting stranger may have reinforced his perception of personal omnipotence. The role of childhood trauma and family dysfunction. Any exploration of Vladimir's psychological underpinnings circles back to his youth, where emotional neglect and an unstable home environment likely laid a precarious foundation. Though neither publicly released records nor interviews point to a singular, catastrophic trauma, such as extreme physical abuse, his experiences of chronic domestic tension, a father prone to outbursts, and a mother overwhelmed by her own illnesses formed a confluence of negative influences. Numerous criminological studies highlight how children in chaotic families often develop maladaptive coping mechanisms. In Vladimir's world, lying and emotional detachment served as protective strategies. By retreating inward, he insulated himself from the unpredictability of his father's moods and the disarray that surrounded him. Over time, these coping strategies hardened, mutating into a worldview that relegated others to roles in his private drama, chess pieces to be maneuvered or sacrificed. It is also worth noting that while not all individuals from turbulent backgrounds morph into violent criminals, certain predispositions, psychological vulnerabilities, or genetically influenced temperaments can interact with such environments to produce extreme outcomes. The presence of subtle but consistent behavioral red flags during Vladimir's adolescence suggests a spiraling synergy between innate personality traits and a neglectful environment. Honing the art of manipulation, one of the most unsettling facets of Vladimir's psychological profile is his meticulous approach to manipulation. From the late teenage years onward, he demonstrated uncanny skill in reading social cues, identifying vulnerabilities, and molding narratives to his advantage. Acquaintances from bars recalled how he adeptly mirrored the speech patterns of those around him, making them feel at ease. When questioned by authorities on minor matters, he displayed selective memory, volunteering partial truths that sowed confusion yet shielded him from suspicion. This behavioral repertoire resonates with what some psychologists label predatory manipulation, akin to the tactics of con artists or predatory psychopaths. It's marked by an intuitive ability to mimic empathy, deploy charm or intimidation as needed, and exploit fleeting opportunities to gain control over a situation or a person. In Vladimir's case, these manipulations culminated in far graver ends than financial cons. They paved the way for physical harm and, in numerous instances, lethal violence. Further complicating matters, nothing. Vladimir's manipulative artistry also extended to the investigative phase. Detectives recounted that during interrogations, he oscillated between cooperative candor and feigned ignorance. He might supply plausible, sounding details on one minor aspect of a case, only to clam up when pressed on a critical point. These psychological maneuvers made it difficult to ascertain truth from deception, requiring investigators to rely heavily on forensic evidence. Bridging the gap. Mental states and moral agency. Crime analysts frequently grapple with the question of moral agency in individuals who commit extreme violence. Are they fully aware of the harm inflicted? Or do they operate under a distorted, genuinely delusional moral framework? In Vladimir's scenario, the consensus among professionals leans strongly toward the former. There is little to suggest he experienced genuine delusions or psychotic breaks. Rather, his capacity for premeditation, meticulous evasion, and consistent attempts to hide evidence show a clear awareness of wrongdoing and a desire to avoid legal consequences. Indeed, testimonies from certain victims who survived less severe assaults indicated that Vladimir would sometimes speak in calm, rational tones about why they had to comply, suggesting he not only recognized the moral transgression but believed he had a strategic right or need to commit it. These instances undermine any argument that he was cognitively detached from reality. Instead, that they paint a portrait of a man who perceived moral standards as constraints applying only to others. Constraints he could ignore if they conflicted with his personal aims. Such moral compartmentalization is a hallmark of certain high-functioning psychopaths. They intellectually grasp social norms but opt to disregard them, driven by a sense of entitlement and lacking any internal impetus, like empathy or guilt, to moderate their actions. Vladimir's meticulously disguised lifestyle underscores that he understood society's condemnation. His subterfuges were not the actions of someone clueless about right or wrong, but of someone who placed personal predatory desires above communal ethics. Exploring the cultural and socioeconomic backdrop, no individual exists in a vacuum, and Vladimir's behavior unfolded against a broader socioeconomic and cultural tapestry. The city where he resided was in a period of transition. Once reliant on heavy industry, it faced waves of unemployment and shifting demographics. Marginalized groups proliferated, many living on the fringes with minimal police protection. In such an atmosphere, a cunning predator could operate with relative impunity, confident that missing person investigations would remain low priority. Moreover, local distrust of law enforcement, rooted in historical corruption and ineptitude, may have contributed to victims or witnesses hesitating to file reports. A culture of silence often prevailed, with citizens preferring to handle problems within their community rather than invite state scrutiny. Vladimir, acutely aware of these dynamics, capitalized on the reluctance of vulnerable people to seek official help. In addition, cultural norms emphasizing stoicism or familial privacy can hinder early detection of mental health concerns. If young Vladimir displayed ominous traits, neighbors or relatives might have dismissed them as personal quirks or household issues not meant for external meddling. The end result was a social environment that permitted him to grow unimpeded into a covertly dangerous adult. How repeated success shaped his self-perception. A one dimension of Vladimir's psychological journey concerns how each successful offense seemingly bolstered his sense of mastery. Repeated evasion of law enforcement reinforced an internal narrative of superiority, presumably feeding a grandiose self-image that believed he could outsmart virtually anyone. This cyclical pattern, violence, evasion, reward, can fortify pathological behavior as the perpetrator experiences minimal deterrence and significant psychological payoff. This phenomenon echoes what criminologists term criminal invincibility syndrome, wherein the offender, having tested the boundaries of social and legal systems, convinces themselves they are beyond capture. Ironically, such hubris often becomes their undoing. Overconfidence leads to mistakes or escalations that attract more attention, as we observed in Vladimir's final spree. Nonetheless, until that downfall arrives, the criminal feels emboldened, potentially intensifying the brutality of subsequent crimes. For Vladimir, this internal hubris likely coexisted with a methodical caution. He was confident, yes, but not recklessly so. He took pains to create false aliases, relocate frequently, and destroy evidence. Each time law enforcement stumbled, it underscored his self-perceived cunning. The meltdown came only after the formation of a dedicated task force and the emergence of survivors like Marina, whose testimony set in motion the final unmasking. The significance of partial confession and psychological closure during the pre-trial and trial phases. Vladimir's behavior vacillated in perplexing ways. There were instances where he admitted, in part, to certain assaults but minimized the severity, blaming mutual misunderstandings. Some professionals interpret this partial confession approach as strategic, a way to appear somewhat cooperative, hoping to bargain for leniency. Psychologically, it might also reflect the tension between his narcissistic desire to flaunt control and his fear of ultimate accountability. Victim families, on the other hand, struggled with the incompleteness of these admissions. Partial confessions left them uncertain about the fates of missing loved ones or the true extent of Vladimir's cruelty. The question of closure loomed large. As is common with many serial offenders, Vladimir seemed to relish holding back details, maintaining a sense of power by refusing full disclosure. This manipulative tactic deepened the anguish for those seeking final answers. Courts in such cases sometimes rely on forensic evidence to fill the gaps left by an uncooperative defendant. In Vladimir's trial, the psychological analysis presented by experts demonstrated he possessed the capacity to plan, grasp the consequences, and manipulate outcomes, qualities at odds with any insanity defense, while certain mitigating factors, like a turbulent childhood, were cited. They did little to overshadow the sheer gravity and cold-bloodedness of his actions. Broader lessons about early detection and social safety nets reflecting upon Vladimir Vinničevsky's psychological arc. A crucial lesson emerges about the need for vigilant communities and robust social safety nets. While no system can prevent all pathological behavior, early red flags, extreme social withdrawal, consistent deception, fascination with cruelty, should prompt professional evaluations. Had Vladimir been flagged as a high-risk youth, perhaps a therapeutic or corrective approach might have deterred him from a deadly path. Furthermore, community awareness stands as a vital counterbalance to predatory opportunists. In neighborhoods where citizens communicate concerns and trust law enforcement, patterns of suspicious behavior can be documented and acted upon swiftly. In Vladimir's city, the fragmentation of social structures and the pervasive cynicism about the police created a vacuum that he exploited. Equally significant is the moral imperative for media and educational programs to demystify mental health interventions. If families recognized that seeking help for a troubled child did not equate to social disgrace, but was instead a responsible step, fewer potential offenders might slip through the cracks. Vladimir's case underscores how ignorance, shame, and underfunded services converge tragically. A final note on evil and complexity. In exploring the psyche of a figure like Vladimir Vinničevsky, it is tempting to simplify the story, labeling him as pure evil or beyond human comprehension. While his acts undeniably suggest profound malice, a purely demonic narrative overlooks the intricate interplay of psychological, social, and cultural elements. Evil, in this context, might be understood as the tragic outcome when a series of risk factors, personal pathology, inadequate guidance, environmental enablers, converge unchecked, recognizing that complexity doesn't absolve his cruelty. Rather, it highlights that preventing future offenders necessitates addressing the entire ecosystem that fosters them. And so, we step back from the dark corridor of Vladimir's psyche. His cunning, his manipulation, his capacity for unspeakable violence. These traits formed a tapestry of depravity that left an indelible mark on the city he terrorized. The final step in our exploration is to reconcile the local community's quest for closure with the broader lessons gleaned. In the concluding section, we shall reflect on how Vladimir's story stands as both a cautionary tale and a call to action for authorities, citizens, and mental health advocates alike. Part Feature. The end, the saga of Vladimir Vinničevsky, exemplifies the darkest extremes of human capacity, a quiet, unassuming individual who nurtured hidden impulses, owning them through manipulation, violence, and a studied awareness of communal blind spots. For years, he eluded police scrutiny by exploiting fragmented systems and targeting those who seemed unlikely to prompt large-scale investigations. Each act contributed to a self-perpetuating cycle of confidence, culminating only when a critical mass of evidence converged, when survivors like Marina finally broke through the wall of anonymity he so carefully constructed. Amid the shock and horror, it is essential to remember the human lives entangled in his legacy. Families of victims grappled with loss, confusion, nothing, and the torment of not knowing what happened to their loved ones until the final confessions and forensic breakthroughs. Each name or face attached to his crimes represents a story unfairly cut short. In the pursuit of closure, we owe them a measure of honor, ensuring their experiences are recognized rather than drowned out by sensational headlines or the mystique some might wrongly attribute to a figure like Vladimir. The lessons gleaned from this case extend beyond any one city or jurisdiction. First, societies must invest in effective early warning frameworks. Children exhibiting abnormal behaviors or profound social detachment should not be dismissed as mere eccentrics without thorough evaluation. Increased availability of counseling services and mental health education can direct at-risk individuals toward therapeutic paths, potentially halting a future spree of violence. Second, law enforcement agencies benefit immeasurably from inter-district data sharing. Had Vladimir's early minor transgressions or suspicious circumstances been properly linked, an investigative breakthrough might have arrived sooner. Equally vital is public participation. Community awareness and willingness to cooperate with police are powerful deterrents against predators who rely on communal silence, neighbors who trust authorities with concerns, survivors who come forward without fear of being dismissed, and vigilant local media can all amplify the protective net. While these steps may not eradicate every threat, they significantly narrow the corridors where someone like Vladimir can operate undetected. Finally, the moral dimension of such cases challenges us to confront the disquieting possibility that within everyday life, dangerous forces can lurk behind calm exteriors. Acknowledging this truth need not spawn paranoia. Rather, it can foster prudent alertness. We must cultivate spaces where empathy and understanding counterbalance isolation, where mental health resources address emergent crises, and where collective vigilance stands guard against those who would do harm. Thank you for accompanying me on this extensive journey through Vladimir Vinničevsky's life, crimes, and psychological underpinnings. Nothing if you found value in this examination. If it broadened your understanding of how cunning predators evolve, or sparked reflection on ways communities can fortify themselves, I encourage you to share these insights with others. Please consider liking and subscribing if this content resonates with you. Together, we can continue exploring real life cases that illuminate both the vulnerabilities and resilience within human societies. In studying the darkest chapters, we learn how to shine a guiding light that might prevent future tragedies, and that, ultimately, is our best tribute to those who suffer.